I stepped into Crestfall Consulting like I did every morning, swiping my ID at the security gate, greeting the receptionist with a polite nod. Today, though, there was a strange tension in the air, a current of whispered anticipation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I clutched my coffee cup a bit tighter, thinking it was just the usual Monday stress. But as I moved past the front desks, I realized something was very wrong. Standing in the middle of the open office space was my husband, Jacob Caldwell, tall and self-assured. His dark hair slicked neatly back, wearing his favored charcoal suit that usually gave him an air of dignity. Only this time, his arm was draped around the waist of a woman I barely recognized, someone I'd seen maybe once in passing, if at all. She had glossy black hair and wore a fitted red dress, the kind you might wear to a cocktail party rather than an office. The moment I laid eyes on her, my chest tightened with an inexplicable jolt. Her name, I would soon learn, was Jade. He made his little announcement with a triumphant glint in his eye, as though he'd just made the most brilliant business move of his career. "Everyone meet Jade," Jacob said smoothly, pausing long enough for people to turn their heads. "She'll be taking Bianca's position from here on out." His voice rang across the space like a starter's gun. Silence dropped like a lead weight. Every face turned toward him, then toward me, confusion etched into their expressions. A wave of hot embarrassment seared my skin. I struggled to keep my grip on my coffee cup steady. Jacob's gaze shifted to mine. There was no apology in his eyes, no hesitation at all. Just cold, calculated satisfaction, like a king who'd just dethroned someone in a single public move. I stared at him, 1,000 questions pounding in my head. Why here? Why now? Why so cruel? But I kept my mouth shut. Jade's red lips curled into a smirk. I could practically feel her delight. I forced myself not to look away. The entire floor felt like it was holding its breath. My colleague Raina stood a few desks away, her jaw clenched in outrage. A wave of pity flitted across the faces of others, but no one dared speak. Jacob's tone was final. With one swift decree, he'd undone everything I thought we'd built together, personally and professionally. I cleared my throat, pushing down the urge to scream. "Sure," I said, with a veneer of calm so thin I could taste blood from biting the inside of my cheek. "I'll make sure Jade has everything she needs." Jacob gave a small nod, evidently satisfied that I wasn't going to cause a scene. His arm remained wrapped around Jade's waist as they turned toward what used to be our shared corner office, the private workspace we designed to reflect both of our tastes. Now it was apparently theirs. I walked briskly to my desk, my real desk in the communal area, and eased into the chair as though every muscle in my body was made of stone. That single moment, the way he announced Jade's presence and her new position, drew a line between my old life and whatever came next. I couldn't stop replaying it. A few months ago, Jacob had started acting distant, always busy. Whenever I asked about the endless late meetings, he brushed me off, claiming new clients demanded more face time. But I felt something off, like a shadow creeping at the edge of our marriage. I had chalked it up to stress, told myself we just needed a vacation, a chance to reconnect. Then the real clues began to surface. A pair of unfamiliar earrings in his car's cup holder, a faint perfume on his shirts that didn't match mine, suspicious glances from coworkers who clearly knew something I didn't. Our anniversary dinner had been postponed 3 times until it just never happened. He'd come home one night with a stain on his collar that looked suspiciously like lipstick. He'd made some excuse about signing a contract at a fancy restaurant, leaning in for a congratulatory hug from a client. I'd known it was a lie, but I had no evidence. And deep down I still wanted to believe in us. I pressed my palms against my temples, willing the headache away. That morning's humiliating scene kept flashing before my eyes. She wasn't just some fling. She was part of a calculated plan to push me out. My name was on the official documents as co-founder of Crestfall Consulting. Jacob and I had started this place together with nothing but 2 laptops, a shared dream, and a small nest egg. Now, that dream was being torn from my hands by the very man I had trusted beyond reason. My phone buzzed with a text from Reina. "This is insane. Are you okay?" I typed back a quick response. "We'll talk later. Meet me by the break room at noon." I needed time to think, time to breathe, time to plan. For the rest of the morning I feigned composure, half-heartedly answering emails and pretending not to notice the hush that fell whenever I passed by a group of colleagues. The rumor mill was already in overdrive, but I tuned it out. If Jacob believed he could destroy me in one swift move, he had underestimated me terribly. At exactly noon, I slipped away to the break room, which was conveniently empty. Reina appeared moments later, arms folded, fury written on her face. "I can't believe he did that in public," she hissed, making sure the door was closed behind her. "And Jade. I didn't even know who she was until this morning. What's going on?" I explained, voice shaking despite my attempts at composure, that Jacob had clearly been seeing Jade for a while. My humiliating introduction to her was his way of forcing me out, personally and professionally. We both knew that my stake in the company wasn't trivial. But image was everything. If he made me look incompetent or replaced, he might manage to push me aside without too many eyebrows raised. Reina's eyes narrowed. "He can't just do that. You're a co-owner." I chewed the inside of my cheek. "Yes, but he's cunning. If he can sabotage my standing, make it look like I've been slacking, or paint me as unwilling to fulfill my duties, he could rally the board. He might force me to sell my shares or sign them away under pressure." "You'll fight," Reina said firmly. I let out a slow breath. "Oh, I will. But I need proof. Something that shows he's crossing ethical lines, or even legal ones." She nodded, understanding. "You're not alone in this. The staff is rattled. Everyone saw how he humiliated you. A lot of them still respect you." I reached out, giving her hand a grateful squeeze. "Thank you. Let's just keep this between us for now. I don't want Jacob catching wind that I'm digging into his secrets." She gave me a reassuring nod. "Got it. We'll get him." That day, I managed to slip out a bit early under the guise of having an appointment. My heart pounded as I walked to the parking garage. My car felt like a sanctuary, the only place I could breathe without eyes watching me. I locked the doors and exhaled, letting the pain surface now that I was alone. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I willed them not to fall. I gripped the steering wheel, remembering how just a year ago, Jacob had asked me to renew our vows. We'd both laughed at the idea, saying we were too busy building the company. We'd promised we'd do it after we reached a new milestone. Now it was all ashes. I let the anger replace the tears. Anger was empowering. It reminded me that I didn't deserve this, that I had as much right to crestfall consulting as Jacob did. More even, since I'd put in the long nights and weekends right alongside him. That evening I made my first move. I sat down at my home office desk, once a cozy space Jacob and I shared, and fired up my laptop. Carefully I combed through old contracts, shared drives, archived emails. There were suspicious red flags I'd ignored. Unusual hotel expenses billed to the company, invoices for consultant work that led to non-existent entities. I saved every shred of it into a secure folder. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I forced myself to stop. My back ached, and my eyes stung from staring at the screen. But I had found enough to suspect that Jacob was not just unethical but possibly committing corporate fraud. And with Jade in the mix, there might be an even deeper scandal. If I could prove they used company funds to finance their affair, well, that would be the leverage I needed. The next morning as I entered the office, I spotted Jade perched at my old desk again, rummaging through drawers like she owned the place. Jacob stood beside her, sipping from a tall latte. They were laughing, heads bent close. For the briefest moment I hesitated, feeling the sting in my gut that this used to be us. We'd share coffee, plan the day, and take on the business world together. Now I was an outsider looking in on a life that used to be mine. I squared my shoulders. "Good morning," I said, as though the tension didn't exist. Jade turned, her eyes flicking over me. "Bianca," she drawled, "Jacob wants me to help restructure your department." Could you pass along any key reports? Jacob didn't speak. He just watched me, waiting for a reaction. I offered my most polished smile. Of course. I'll send them your way. Then I walked toward the far side of the office, ignoring the adrenaline spike coursing through my veins. All day I could sense the eyes on me. Some sympathetic, some curious, a few even gleeful at the unfolding drama. People pretended to focus on their work, but every time I stood up or moved around, hushes followed. By lunchtime, Jade had called an impromptu meeting to discuss departmental realignment. I felt my blood boil at how she used corporate jargon to mask her power play. She sat at the head of the table, crossing her legs as though she'd been in charge for years. Jacob hovered beside her, arms folded, an air of satisfaction radiating from him. "Thank you all for coming," Jade began. "I'll be spearheading some changes around here to boost efficiency and ensure we stay ahead in this competitive market." Her gaze slid to me. "Given that Bianca has been, transitioning out, we need to define new leadership roles." Clenched my jaw. This was it, my public sidelining. She was not just the mistress. She was the chosen successor to everything I'd built. Kept silent though. I refused to let them see my hurt. Jade rattled on about synergy and new directions. Jacob interjected occasionally, throwing in corporate buzzwords like vision and leverage. I almost laughed. If only they knew I held the real leverage, tucked away in encrypted files. That night I followed Jacob after work. Felt surreal, like I was in some spy movie. A part of me hated stooping to this level, but I needed the final nail in the coffin. Some undeniable proof. He left the office around 7:30 p.m., got into his sleek black car and drove downtown. Kept a careful distance. He pulled into the parking lot of the Aurelia Hotel, the same place we'd celebrated a major contract signing once upon a time. I waited a few minutes, then hurried inside. The lobby was all warm lights, marble floors, and whispers of piano music from a distant lounge. I spotted him by the elevator. And there was Jade, stepping out of a corner, slipping an arm around his waist. They exchanged a brief, intimate kiss before the elevator whisked them up. Something broke inside me. My vision blurred with anger and heartbreak. But I didn't cry. I turned on my heel, marched back to my car and sped home. Everything was clear. There was no misunderstanding. No shred of plausible denial. I spent the next few days in overdrive, gathering every piece of incriminating evidence. Hotel receipts, company credit card statements that showed suspicious charges at restaurants, florists, and the Aurelia Hotel. A few emails, carelessly referencing private meetings. Jacob and Jade had been astonishingly sloppy, perhaps so certain that I would never look. Then on a Wednesday morning, the final blow landed. Jacob waltzed into my cramped new desk area with a thick envelope. He set it down without preamble. "We need to talk," he said quietly. I recognized the look in his eyes. Cold determination, the same expression he wore when cutting failing projects to save costs. I opened the envelope. Divorce papers. Already signed by him. A jagged wave of emotion ripped through me, but I kept my face impassive. He watched carefully, probably expecting tears or pleading. Instead, I took a pen from the holder, flicked through a few pages, and scribbled my signature. The entire process took less than a minute. Jacob blinked. "That's it?" he asked, voice tight. "You're not even going to fight?" I offered him a thin smile, heart pounding in my chest. Why would I fight for someone who parades his mistress around the office, humiliates me in front of my colleagues, and tries to push me out of my own company? He clenched his jaw. "Bianca, you need to understand." "I don't need to understand anything." I closed the folder, slid it back to him. "We're done here." He hesitated, as though waiting for me to change my mind, to beg him to stay or to sob about how unfair it was. But I gave him nothing. After a tense moment, he nodded sharply and walked out. The ring on my finger felt heavier than ever, so I slipped it off and placed it in my desk drawer. The moment felt both freeing and tragic. I took the rest of the day off, drifting in a haze. At home, I stared at our wedding photo for a long time before tucking it away in a box. This was a heartbreak I'd have to process, but not yet. There was still one final act to play out: the downfall of Jacob Caldwell. A week passed. I moved through each day with a controlled calm, listening to office gossip, quietly collecting more evidence. Raina kept me informed about Jade's disastrous restructuring. She was alienating major clients, pushing senior employees to quit. The company was hemorrhaging goodwill. Meanwhile, I scheduled a discreet meeting with the board of directors. Most of them had known me from the early days. They didn't love me necessarily, but they respected the results I used to deliver. The day of the board meeting, I arrived in a crisp black suit, portfolio under my arm, face set. The conference room was plush and intimidating, with a long mahogany table, tall windows, and framed accolades on the walls. The board members were already seated, murmuring among themselves. Jade and Jacob were there too, looking uneasy. Jacob's father, Frederick Caldwell, the founder and original financier of Crestfall Consulting, sat at the head of the table, stony-faced. "Thank you all for joining," Frederick began. "We've had some alarming reports lately, and I'd like to get to the bottom of them." Jacob cleared his throat. "Dad, we can handle it internally. Bianca's just..." Frederick raised a hand, cutting him off. "We'll hear from Bianca first." I glanced at Jacob. He looked tense, but I saw flickers of anger in his eyes, like a cornered animal. Jade's expression was rigid, her red lips pressed thin. I set my portfolio on the table, flipped it open. "I appreciate the chance to speak," I said, my tone measured. "I have concerns about potential misuse of company funds and mismanagement of client accounts under Jacob's leadership. I've collected evidence that suggests a pattern of personal expenses being billed to corporate cards, as well as questionable changes to long-standing client contracts." Hush fell. One of the board members, a silver-haired woman named Malin, leaned forward. "Do you have documentation, Ms. Caldwell?" I swallowed, ignoring the pang at still being called by his last name, and slid several printed reports across the table. "These are copies of invoices, receipts, and email threads that indicate personal activities. Hotel stays, restaurant bills, were all charged to the company under various project codes. These codes never correlated with any legitimate business spending." Jade's nostrils flared. She looked at Jacob, who was turning pale. He tried to speak, but Frederick stopped him. Another board member frowned as he flipped through the pages. "This is serious, Jacob," the man said. "You do realize this is borderline fraud?" Jacob's composure began to slip. I didn't realize those expenses went onto the corporate cards. There must have been a mix-up." I calmly produced more printouts, ignoring the twinge of satisfaction. "Here are emails from Jade to the billing department, authorizing the charges as client entertainment. Yet there's no record of a client in attendance for these transactions. No contract expansions, no sign of legitimate business justification." Jade shot to her feet, voice trembling with indignation. "That's not fair. Those were business dinners. It's not my fault if the receipts got mislabeled. Frederick pinned her with a cold stare. "Sit down." She sank back into her chair. Then his gaze shifted to Jacob. "I trusted you to run Crestfall the way we built it. Now I find you've been squandering funds and risking our reputation. Explain yourself." Jacob opened and closed his mouth, floundering. He shot me a look filled with hatred, but I kept my chin high. "Dad, this is being blown out of proportion. Bianca's trying to sabotage me because of our divorce. She wants..." "It's not a matter of want," I interjected, my voice crisp. "It's a matter of facts. Those documents speak for themselves." The board members exchanged glances. Malin let out a sigh. "I've been concerned about the sudden changes. We lost a key client last month because of Jade's so-called restructuring. This might be the tipping point." Frederick pressed his lips together, then nodded. I moved to suspend Jacob Caldwell from his position as CEO and begin a formal investigation into financial misconduct. The vote was immediate, a chorus of ayes, and before Jacob could even protest, Frederick banged his gavel, an antiquated but symbolic gesture. Jacob Caldwell, you're relieved of your duties. Effective immediately. Jay turned pale. What about me? She blurted, voice shaking. Frederick's voice was cold. As you were hired under suspicious circumstances, I see no reason to continue your contract. Your services are no longer required. She froze, looking at Jacob for help, but he could barely meet her eyes. He realized he was cornered. Security was called to escort them out. As they walked down the hallway, I followed at a short distance, my footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Outside, in the marble lobby, Jacob spun around to face me. Anger and something resembling desperation twisted his features. You think you've won, he hissed. I held his gaze, feeling both pain and liberation. No, Jacob. It's not about winning or losing. It's about holding you accountable. And it's about me finally stepping out of your shadow. He stared, speechless. Jade muttered something under her breath, glaring at me, and stalked off. Jacob turned to follow, shoulders slumped. The man who once held himself like an untouchable king now looked small, defeated, undone by his own hubris. The glass doors slid shut behind them with a mechanical hiss. I stood there, the rush of adrenaline fading, replaced by a sense of profound relief. For so long I'd felt powerless, but I had taken my power back. I hadn't just destroyed Jacob's illusions. I'd freed myself from his betrayal. Frederick approached, his expression grim. I'm sorry it came to this, he said. You were always a valued part of Crestfall, Bianca. I appreciate that, I replied softly. But I think it's time I find my own path. He nodded. If you ever want to return, my door is open. I thanked him but knew in my heart that I was done with Crestfall. It had become tainted by Jacob's duplicity, and I wanted a fresh slate. Within days, the news spread. Jacob Caldwell had been ousted in disgrace, Jade was gone, and rumors flew about possible lawsuits or even criminal charges if the investigation uncovered more serious violations. The next few weeks felt like a whirlwind. I finalized the divorce details, dividing assets, collecting my rightful portion. I refused to let bitterness guide my decisions. I just wanted closure. In the background, I quietly met with potential investors and old contacts who believed in my expertise. A seed of an idea grew in my mind, to start my own consultancy, grounded in integrity and authenticity, everything Jacob had thrown away. One evening, after sorting through the final stack of legal paperwork, I sat alone in the living room of my small but cozy apartment. The walls were still bare, just a few boxes stacked against the couch. I had left behind the suburban home Jacob and I once shared, choosing instead to start fresh in the city. It was strange, a little lonely, but also exhilarating. Raina visited with pizza and wine, the two of us sitting cross-legged on the floor like college roommates. We clinked our glasses. To new beginnings, she said, eyes bright with encouragement. I took a sip, exhaling the tension that had built up over months of deception. To new beginnings, I echoed. And to never letting someone else define our worth. The next morning I woke early, a buzz of ambition in my bloodstream. I set up my laptop at the small dining table and began drafting a business plan for Caldwell Innovations, a name I chose half out of irony. Despite the memories tied to that surname, I wanted to reclaim it for something positive. Eventually I might change it, but for now it felt right to use the name I'd spent years helping to build. Only this time, it wouldn't be a reflection of Jacob's ego, but of my own resilience. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I threw myself into the new venture. The first client I landed was a mid-sized tech firm looking to restructure after a messy leadership scandal. It felt poetic, helping them clean up a situation much like the one Jacob created. Word spread about my integrity and hands-on approach. Within 6 months, I hired a small team, including Raina, who left Crestfall after the dust settled. We worked late nights, brainstorming solutions for struggling companies. We championed transparency and accountability, and it worked. By the time a year passed, Caldwell Innovations had established a reputation as a boutique agency that delivered results. We specialized in crisis management, ironically becoming experts in cleaning up the sort of mess Jacob had thrust upon me. I found satisfaction in guiding leaders toward ethical, sustainable success. With every success story, I felt a piece of my own scars fading. Then, on a crisp autumn evening, I attended a charity gala. It was the same event Jacob and I had attended every year, back when we were a power couple. This time, I arrived alone but confident, wearing a navy gown that made me feel strong. I shook hands, mingled, introduced myself as Bianca Caldwell of Caldwell Innovations, feeling pride in the name I had made for myself. Across the room, near the bar, I spotted a familiar figure. Jacob. He looked as though he'd aged a decade, dark circles under his eyes, a forced smile plastered on his face as he chatted with a bored-looking businessman. I sipped my drink, wondering if he would acknowledge me. Sure enough, he caught my eye, paused in mid-sentence, and excused himself from the conversation. He approached, trying to straighten his blazer as if that would restore his lost dignity. "Bianca," he greeted, voice subdued. I inclined my head. "Jacob." No bitterness, no forced politeness. Just neutrality. He hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. I wanted to say, "Sorry. For everything." His gaze flicked to the floor. Things spiraled, and I did a lot of damage. I studied him for a heartbeat, feeling an odd sense of compassion. He looked broken, far from the arrogant man who'd once dismissed me in front of the entire office. "I appreciate the apology," I said gently. "But I've moved on." He looked down at his drink, nodding. "I can see that. Your company is making waves." His tone held both respect and regret. "Maybe if I'd realized how capable you were from the start. But I guess that's hindsight." "Hindsight," I repeated. "We all make choices. We live with the consequences." He stood there, perhaps waiting for me to say more, to offer him absolution. But I had nothing left to give. Our story was finished. When the silence stretched, he forced a tight smile and turned away. I watched him fade into the crowd of glittering gowns and tuxedos, shoulders hunched. A strange lightness settled over me. The pain was no longer there, just a memory of what once was. I wandered through the gala, chatting with acquaintances, collecting business cards. Somewhere along the line, a spark lit inside me. I realized I wasn't just free of Jacob. I was free of my own doubt. Everything he took from me, I'd reclaimed. Everything he believed I couldn't do without him, I was doing better alone. That night, after leaving the gala, I drove to my apartment, the city lights shining like possibilities in the rearview mirror. I stepped onto my small balcony, letting the cool breeze wash over my skin. I closed my eyes, remembering the day Jacob had humiliated me in front of the entire office, how I'd felt so powerless, so lost. Now I felt neither of those things. I felt powerful, alive. My phone buzzed with a notification, an email from a new client, apparently impressed by my work at another firm. A chance for an even bigger partnership, the kind of opportunity that would have thrilled me back in the early days with Jacob. I smiled to myself, stepping inside to draft a reply. Life was different now, better because I was in control. In the months that followed, Caldwell Innovations expanded further. Raina took on a senior role, and we brought in 2 more consultants. We set up a mentorship program for smaller startups, teaching them how to avoid the pitfalls of unethical leadership. Sometimes I'd read about Jacob in the business columns. He tried to launch new ventures, but each fizzled quickly, no doubt hampered by his tainted reputation. Jade was nowhere to be found. Rumor had it she moved to another city, attempting to start fresh under a different last name. I felt only mild curiosity. She was nothing to me now. Then, on a bright spring afternoon, I signed the lease to an even bigger office space, one with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling heart of downtown. As I stood in that empty sunlit expanse, boxes of equipment lined against the walls, Raina and a few others congratulated me. I took a moment, stepping away from the chatter, letting the gravity of it all sink in. Jacob Caldwell had once overshadowed my every move, convincing me I needed him. But the truth was, I never did. I'd built something stronger, more ethical, and more successful on my own terms. When I left that new office for the day, I lingered by the entrance, scanning the city street. Pedestrians hurried by, cars honked in the distance, and I felt a subtle hum in my veins, excitement for what was still to come. This was my happy ending, I realized. Not a fairy tale of reuniting with a man who'd wronged me, but a story of carving my own path, forging my own destiny from the rubble he left behind. No longer was I the woman who stepped into the office every morning, blindly trusting the man by her side. Now I was the woman who stepped into her own office, head held high, creating opportunities for those around her, proving that betrayal could become the catalyst for a far greater triumph. And that, I thought with a quiet smile, was the best revenge of all. Do you think Jacob ever truly understood the damage he caused? Or did he only regret facing the consequences? Would you have handled his downfall any differently? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more jaw-dropping tales, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Your support means everything.